I invite you to stand for the reading of the Gospel, which today comes from Matthew 20, verses 1 to 16. And we get to hear the story upon which the skit was based. This is a parable that Jesus tells about the kingdom of God. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them to his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, "You also, go to the vineyard and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last, then going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more. But each one of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But the landowner replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to the last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I'm generous?" So the last will be first, and the first will be last. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. The world in which Jesus lived and taught was rough when compared to 21st century Western standards. Very broadly speaking, there were the haves and the have-nots. Those who possessed land and money, were always going to be in that category. And those who were the have-nots, those who didn't have land or money, would always stay in that category. Generally, social location was something that was set and couldn't be changed. Land and wealth and position passed on from generation to generation for those who had it. And there was no social ladder to climb, no American dream in this culture. In that social construct in the Roman Empire, it was of course acknowledged that those who were wealthy still needed people to do the work for them in their lands. And so a landless person would want to get connected to a wealthy family. The landless person, in this context, they're called a client. The landless person would show up first thing in the morning at the home of one of the landowners, and in this context, they're called a patron. They would go to the patron's home and wait to see what the patron would ask them to do that day. And so the client, during the day, would do menial work for the patron, and then he or she would receive a meal during the day. And maybe the patron would make some sort of small kind of favor on behalf of the client. Now, once a client was attached to a patron, for the most part, they would remain completely loyal to that family and to that person. They would only go there. They would only serve that household. They would show up early in the morning only at that home. The client would be fiercely loyal to that family and would speak the patron's praises around town. But the hierarchy was still pretty much set. These were not social equals. These were not friends. These were people who were doing something in order to be able to survive, and each stayed in their own social location. And you could probably imagine that there were patrons who were really tyrants, who took advantage of this situation. And you could also imagine that there were patrons who were generous and kind. And so Jesus uses this context to tell a parable about what God's realm would be like. And so there was this landowner, this patron, and he had a vineyard, and that needed to be harvested. And in the audience, they would have known that kind of work. Either they would have done it themselves, or they knew people who did. I'm not sure if there were patrons in the original group that was listening to Jesus as he was sharing this parable, but maybe there were. And in that context, then, when Jesus started telling the story, there would have been some raised eyebrows right from the start. Because the landowner goes to the marketplace looking for people. The landowner doesn't just open the gate and sees who's already there, goes out into the marketplace to get people. That's something that they would have sent a servant or a manager to have gone and to have done. So that is already an unusual situation. Anyway, so the people that the landowner finds at the square come and work for him in the vineyard. And the deal is 1 day's wage, and that is a little silver coin called a denarius. They would get 1 coin at the end of the day. But then the weirdness in the story continues. Again, the patron goes back to the marketplace, not something that they would have done, certainly not in the middle of the day. And then you get to thinking, who are these workers who are still around? Well, certainly these are not people who were already attached to one of the patrons, right? So these are the unattached. Certainly these are not the people who rose early in the morning to try to get a job. These probably were not the young. These probably were not the ones that had hustle. And the patrons in the audience would have thought, if my manager had brought me these kinds of workers to work in my vineyard, they would have been in trouble. But then here you have the patron going again and again and getting people later and later in the day and telling them all, I'll just give you what's right. And beggars can be choosers, so they went to do the work. For the landless workers who were in the audience when Jesus was telling the story, I think that they would have also been shocked, although maybe for a different reason. They would have thought, nobody is that nice. My patron wouldn't have done such a thing. I don't think this would ever happen. And so in the parable, as the day ends, the patron asks the manager to distribute the pay. And the ones who were at the very end, the ones who only worked the 1 hour, were the ones that were getting paid first. And they got paid that 1 silver coin. And so word got back about this. But the people who were getting the 1 coin, who had only worked an hour, knew that they didn't deserve it. They knew that they had not done all of the work. And they wondered if this would be a regular gig or not. So you can bet that they were planning to be there at that same vineyard the next day, bright and early. Whatever the owner wants me to do, I will do. So as word got down the line, as people were waiting, those workers who had put in the full 12 hours work began to think, wait a minute, we're in the money now, boys. If these undesirables got paid the full coin, maybe we'll get, maybe we'll get 12 coins. Maybe we'll get 12 silver coins that we can use, and maybe by the time they got to the front of the line, they had already spent that money in their minds. And when they reached out their hand, they get not 12 coins, but the 1. And so that was shocking enough, right? But then it gets even more shocking because they talk back to the landowner. They complain to the landowner. Something you wouldn't do. And say, this is not fair. We worked all day. These people worked 1 hour and they got the same pay we're getting. And then the landowner speaks to the workers. Did you catch this? He calls them friends. They weren't friends. The landowner is upsetting the social world in every which way. He says, friends, have I done you any wrong? I told you I would do this. I told you I would pay you the daily wage, and I haven't. I have not been unfair to you. And the patrons who were in the audience would have winced, because they think, if the guy that owns the property next to mine does this, he's going to make me look bad. This is a terrible idea. Now people are going to start to expect full-time pay for part-time labor. And then everyone else in the audience would have thought, this would never work. This is not sustainable. But the landowner says, don't be jealous. I get to do with my property what I get to do. And Jesus says, this is the way it works with God. God is gracious and generous. God gives even to those who grumble, like in the Exodus story that Michael read. God fed those cranky Israelites whom Moses had been leading through the wandering in the desert. God offers grace to people who others may judge as undeserving. So much so that as God sees it, the ones always coming in last will be put in the front of the line. Did you just think of yourself waiting in line maybe for tickets at the movie theater? Did you just think of somebody cutting the line? Even that example doesn't feel fair. It's an upside-down, shocking world that Jesus is talking about, where there is love and grace for all in equal measure. Maybe it's true that society in the time of Jesus was different, but I think we experience instances of jealousy in the face of generosity today. Listen for echoes of this in conversations you have on a daily basis. Echoes of people who are talking about who deserves and who doesn't deserve something, especially when we refer to people who might be looking for support or assistance. We make judgments, uncritically buying into a narrative that makes people into two camps, those who deserve and those who don't deserve. I recently heard of a town in Indiana which is thinking about limiting first responders who are attending to people who are in an overdose situation. They're going to limit them to 3 dosages of Narcan, the medication you give them to revive a heroin addict. They're going to give them only 3 chances. Why not 2? Why not 1? Why not any at all? The notion that somehow one is more deserving than another, or, well, we'll only help you this far, is to buy into the rhetoric that this addict is just living out what they set out to do. This is what you get. Tough luck, buddy. You don't deserve the 4th dosage. Now think about anti-immigrant rhetoric in the U.S. or in other countries that we might see in the news. Now, as Americans, we romanticize our immigrant roots, especially if in your family Ellis Island is involved in some way. But honestly, we know that even then there was a pecking order for those who were deemed more acceptable, less deserving than others. As it happens, today Presbyterian churches around the country are invited to ponder the gifts that immigrants bring in our midst. We as a congregation partnered with Irvington Presbyterian Church in Indianapolis to support the Alhamwi family. It's a Syrian family that we have helped for a little over a year, and they have resettled from Syria into Indianapolis. The picture, the family, is in the bulletin cover. Now that's an example of a family with tenacity, with courage, with faith, with grace, and with generosity. And those of us who have been privileged enough to meet them and have meals with them have just been blown away by their way of being a family and expressing their faith. There are so many immigrants who are fleeing violence around the globe. And we have to consider how we as a congregation, how we as a country advocate for our new neighbors, not seeing them with jealousy that they receive this or that assistance, but that with a gratitude that knows that our community is able to step in and support them in God's name. And so when you think about that gospel lesson and the skit, consider what character you identify with in the story. If you identify with a landowner, think about how this landowner's generosity is something you embrace in your life. Think about how God is asking you to offer surprising grace all around. If you identify with the late day laborers, how does the landowner's generosity make you want to be loyal? Think about the loyalty to God that we can show in response to God's amazing love for us. And if you identify with the jealous full-day worker, think about how jealousy is keeping you from fully seeing God at work in others and yourself. Listen closely to grumbling echoes of jealousy in you and around you. If you hear them, stop for a moment and open your eyes wide open. Because you might just be in the midst of that story that the parable was telling. And so it might just be that as you look around, you might be able to see God showing surprising grace to someone in society who has been deemed undeserving. Thanks be to God for God's word for us.